Hello. These are the readings, a little bit of a commentary, and even a little bit of a homily for the 24th Sunday of the year, 2018. This year that falls on September the 16th. The first reading is that rather famous third song of the suffering servant from Deutero-Isaiah, and is very important for understanding what's going on in this prophet's mind as he prophesies for Yahweh. Yahweh God opens my ear that I may hear, and I have not rebelled, have not turned back. I gave my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who plucked my beard. My face I did not shield from buffets and spitting. Yahweh God is my help, therefore I am not disgraced. I have set my face like flint, knowing that I shall not be put to shame. He is near who upholds my right. If anyone wishes to oppose me, let us appear together. Who disputes my right? Let that person confront me. See, Yahweh God is my help. Who will prove me wrong? The word of the Lord. The second reading is one that certainly was quoted an awful lot in the 16th century when Martin Luther came up with this idea that we're basically saved by our faith, not by our works. And Catholics especially latched on to this passage from James where he certainly praises the works of faith. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister has nothing to wear and has no food for the day, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and eat well," but you do not give them the necessities of the body, what good is it? So also faith of itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Indeed, someone might say, "You have faith and I have works." Demonstrate your faith to me without works, and I will demonstrate my faith to you from my works. The word of the Lord. Today's gospel begins an interesting series in Mark's gospel, and that's 3 series of predictions of Jesus' passion, death, resurrection, misunderstandings by one of his disciples or the whole lot of disciples, and a clarification of what it means to die with Jesus. Now, this is the first one. We're familiar quite often with the first part of it, but I don't know that we really go down and start understanding what it means also when Jesus talks about carrying his cross. Jesus and his disciples set out for the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Along the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They said in reply, "John the Baptizer, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets." But he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter said to him, "You are the Christ." Then he warned them not to tell anyone about him. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer greatly, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and rise after 3 days. He spoke this openly. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. At this he turned around and, looking at his disciples, rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do." He summoned the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and that of the gospel will save it." The gospel of the Lord. After all the years of theology I studied, all the way back to my grade school days of studying the catechism for 8 years, I often remind myself and my students that Christianity is a very simple faith, or simple religion if you want to institutionalize it. It's not very detailed. The faith simply says, if you die with Jesus, you rise with Jesus. And so all we have to do is die with him, get up enough courage to do that, and one day we will rise with Jesus. Black and white, very clear, frequently spoken about in the Gospels and in Paul's letters. The problem is, how precisely do you die with Jesus? Every Good Friday on some of the cable networks, they show men in one village in the Philippines who take this literally. They are nailed to crosses, nails put in their wrists, nails put in their feet, and they're actually stood up for a certain period of time. They take them down, obviously, before they die, but they are trying to imitate Jesus' death. No one actually in the early church thought that when Jesus spoke about dying with him, that he meant you're supposed to be nailed just like I was to a cross, and you're supposed to die like that. They realized when he spoke about dying, he was speaking on a different level. But he still gets into what you might say trouble when he predicts his passion, death, and resurrection with his disciples, especially Peter. And Peter, who is very interested, I guess, in the prosperity gospel or something like that, Peter says, don't talk about dying. We aren't going to get many converts for this. Just think of all the empty collection baskets we're going to have in our churches if they constantly give homilies on dying. People want to see the glory, the money that you get, the prestige you're awarded just by being your follower. They don't like to hear the word about dying. And Jesus rather nicely says something to him that's really kind of a bitter saying. He says, get behind me, Satan. Now, you have to understand that Satan, first of all, didn't originally in Scripture mean the devil. Satan, in its original Hebrew form, simply meant an obstacle in somebody's path, something that stops you from getting to where you want to get. There's a block in the path or a big rock in there or something that stops you from going around it. And so he's basically telling Peter, you're an obstacle to my own dying and rising by trying to stop me from dying and stop my disciples from dying also and sharing in that resurrection of mine. It's kind of fascinating because he says rather nicely, get behind me. The Greek word for a disciple is mathetes. And that's the word that's always used when Jesus talks about my disciples or be a disciple. And it means a go-behinder, someone who follows someone else. And so Jesus is telling Peter, you stop following me. You're now standing in front of me as an obstacle instead of a disciple, a go-behinder. And so he is saying, get behind me. Then the third thing that happens in these predictions is he clarifies what it means to die. And here the thing that we most take home from it is you have to carry your cross and be behind me, be my disciple, which is here. And basically, when he talks about carrying your cross, we have to remember that would have not made any sense to people before Jesus' own death and resurrection. And so most scholars today think that when Jesus said you carry your cross, he really said you are to carry your tau, T-A-U. The tau is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And people would utilize that tau, sort of an abbreviation, for totality. You're going to do something completely. We would say you're going to do it from A to Z. They would say you're supposed to do it from Aleph to Tau. Or they would just abbreviate it and say you're supposed to do it to the Tau. And so Jesus says you're supposed to be totally dedicated to whatever God wishes you to do. That's the first step in dying, is to be open to God in your life. Certainly after Jesus' death and resurrection, his followers began to look at his tau, his dedication, as a cross. And in a sense, it was a T in Hebrew, so it was kind of like a cross. And they would sometimes, holy pious Jews, even before Jesus, would kind of embroider a tau on their clothes or even tattoo them on their hand as a sign that they were open to whatever Yahweh wished them to do. And so Jesus is saying, if you want to die with me on your way to rising with me, step number one is to carry your tau. Step number one is to be totally open to whatever God asked you. Now, David Tracy years ago gave a lecture at St. Louis University. David Tracy, the former professor in the University of Chicago in theology, Dave basically said, our theological language is very limited. That was the thesis of his particular presentation that night. And he said sometimes the only way you can convey the reality of God working in your life is through contradictions. And he went back to this chapter 8 of Mark passage, the very one I read. If you want to gain your life, you have to lose it. If you lose your life, you gain your life. He used that as the example of biblical contradictions or Christian contradictions, trying to convey a reality that was extremely difficult to put into words. And yet that's the reality. Now, you have to understand this passage that I just read to you from Mark chapter 8 is very artificially put together. I use it sometimes in my courses as a sign of gospel's artificiality, that they weren't put together in any chronological pattern. They might have been put together artificially to convey certain theological points. And here in chapter 8, we have the first prediction. In chapter 9, we have the second prediction. In chapter 10, we have the third prediction. All around a verse or two, a verse 30 in each chapter. And so if you go to chapter 8, 9, and 10, verse 30, you'll find the predictions of Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection. And then right after it, you'll see the disciples of Jesus doing or saying something that tells people we totally misunderstood what it means to die. And then finally, as we saw in this one about carrying your towel, you have an explanation from Jesus about what it really means to die with him. That's why, for instance, that first reading today from Deutero-Isaiah, his third song of the suffering servant of Yahweh. Deutero-Isaiah starts it by saying, Yahweh opens my ear. Carol Stuhmiller, in courses that I had with him years ago on Deutero-Isaiah, Stuhmiller said, this first verse of today's reading is the most perfect definition of a biblical disciple. That person wakes up every morning listening for what God wishes them to do that day. Might be different from what God wished them to do yesterday. Probably won't be the same thing God expects them to do tomorrow. But for this day, God opens my ear. And then Stuhmiller used to stress that the Hebrew word used here for to open is the same word used when they talk about drilling out a well. That basically our job is to drill out our ears every morning, because left to our own lazy self, we can go through the whole day and never even think God's communicating with us, or God's talking to us, or God's giving us what God wishes us to do. And yet if we look at this from the right direction, Deutero-Isaiah is basically saying the same thing 500 years before the birth of Jesus that Jesus stressed when he talked about carrying your towel. We have to be people who are alert to what's happening. We have to be people who take for granted God is communicating with us on one level or another throughout our entire lives. That's why James can throw that second reading in too, to say the acts that we perform have to be acts that we hear God telling us to perform. And we don't do something for somebody that we feel good about doing. We have to do something that really helps them, takes away the hunger that he says there, or the cold they're experiencing. We have no other choice. If we are Christians, other Christ, Mark says step number 1 in that is somehow or another being open to whatever God wishes you to do. Each of us must carry our towel. Francis of Assisi knew practically no scripture, but for some reason that I can't track down, he did know about this towel idea and what it really meant for early Christians. And Francis every once in a while would use this towel even as a signature for his letters. So much so that a lot of Franciscan communities today have integrated a towel into their coat of arms as Francis's way of saying, I'm open to whatever God wishes of my life. I'm open to whatever Jesus is talking to me and telling me to do. I don't think that's a bad symbol for any Christian, certainly the symbol that Jesus used, and certainly when we look at it very carefully, it's a way of dying, because we're constantly giving our will over to the will of God that somehow or another comes into our life. Thank you.